If you've been watching for the last couple of videos, I've been building out the theorem that I'm calling the Refinery Paradox. This is an answer to a lot of the economic conditions and economic theorems that are presented by other influencers on the platform. Um, this Refinery Paradox, the core claim is that whoever controls the infrastructure for AI and data will control the downstream economy. Seems pretty straightforward in terms of just explaining it from the simple point of view. But if you haven't checked out the last two videos that I've done, part one and part two, make sure you go to the link in the description here or check out the video link. Substack, YouTube, and TikTok all have the same content. So if you haven't already liked and subscribed, please take a moment and do that. And drop a comment. Let me know where you're watching from and what your job is, industry, and let me know how you feel about the presentation and the stories that we're putting together. I know a lot of people were actually a big fan of seeing the presentation versus my face on the screen so much. So I actually have another presentation today. I'll let you see a lot of that, and then I'll try to cut back and forth for a couple visuals, help me get the promotional stuff down. Right. So I use the oil refinery metaphor for data centers specifically, but this week, somebody dropped a couple of bombs on data centers in the global conflict in the Middle East. The metaphor literally has become a military target. So today we're going to be covering four connected stories that are all breaking this morning of March 10th, 2026. They represent together the single most important week in enterprise AI infrastructure since the cloud was invented. So AWS data centers were hit by drones in the UAE and Bahrain. And if you haven't already seen this, there's an overall infrastructure investment that's $300 billion in that particular area of the world, right? So the Strait of Hormuz closed. Oil is at $113 per barrel in terms of where it spiked to today. I think it closed and opened at different numbers, but still very shocking to see that oil shock to the market. Oracle is also going through a bit of a battle here as they are expanding their market into artificial intelligence, but they ended up cutting 30,000 jobs to fund the infrastructure bet. We've talked about that as well in some of the theorem and how that relates to real time news. So if you haven't checked that out, again, check the video links. And we talked about how that's going to build a completely different section of the economy to be concerned about, but not a different world, right? But it is a different world than the one you woke up in yesterday because of the continual conflicts and the wars that are happening and the prices that are being impacted and downstream everything that's being impacted. So, yeah, four stories. Let's get through it one at a time. And first one for the section is going to be the data center. So let's just take a look here. But the data centers got hit. Let me give you some numbers that you can kind of take back from this. So again, three AWS data centers were struck. The Iranian drones hit the two facilities in the UAE and Bahrain, one in Bahrain, and AWS has confirmed that has led to structural damage, disrupted power, fire suppression activities, and water damage on top of it. So you can, if you're in infrastructure or security, you can imagine this is a plethora of a bunch of problems that are going to take a while to solve. So, according to reports, Dubai and Abu Dhabi residents have been unable to use mobile apps, check their bank balances, pay for taxis, or order food. So, modern life has been basically put on hold for folks in this part of the world. AWS to customers has the communication, the messaging has been around considering migrating their workloads out of the Middle East entirely. The official language, the regional environment remains unpredictable, according to AWS and folks who are around it. So the Dow and the NASDAQ have dropped 2% on the news of the data center strikes alone that you can find attributed to this, right? The scale of what is now at risk is tremendous. What we're talking about is that, Trump's particular Gulf tour last May 2025 produced over $2 trillion in investment packages from commitments and different discussions. Saudi Arabia pledged $600 billion. The UAE committed $1.4 trillion, targeting AI and chips. Qatar signed $1.2 trillion themselves. Stargate, the UAE, OpenAI, Oracle, NVIDIA, have all planned the largest AI campus outside the United States. 5 gigawatts of compute. Abu Dhabi is going to be one of the major areas to inherit this as well. So Amazon committed $5 billion to the AI hub in Riyadh, and all of this has led to what we would consider being confirmed is that over $300 billion is currently at risk in the area of the Gulf AI zone that was used to really promote for the last couple of years, right? So the bigger story that is also very interesting from this is that um, the undersea cables connecting the Gulf data centers to Africa, Southeast Asia, and South Asia themselves really only go through two specific areas: the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz itself. Both are now effectively closed due to that commercial traffic or the issues, but they're closed to commercial traffic mostly. Iran's Iran's Revolutionary Guard declared the Hormuz is going to be shut down on March 3rd, threatening to set ablaze any vessel attempting passage. At least 5 tankers have been damaged since then. Roughly 150 ships are still stranded around the strait at this moment. In February 2024, Red Sea cables were cut by cargo ships struck by a Houthi missile. One of those cables took 5 months to repair because vessels couldn't safely cross that area. That was an accident. What we're living through currently is not an accident, it's deliberate. And so the question must be asked, what are we preparing for as the new precedent that changes everything has become the statement to work through, right? So before this week, the primary concern from state actors like Iran or any other country that is very independent from the world stage was cyber warfare, hackers, ransomware, DDoS attacks. This week established a new precedent. Physical drone strikes are on hyperscaler data centers are now a viable military attack. One expert was quoted calling this a harbinger of what is to come and warned that these attacks will not be limited to the Middle East. A scary thought. The cloud was never abstract. It has an address and has always had an address. And this week, that address just got hit. So here's what I believe this means for your business, for your personal life, but mostly your enterprise. Every enterprise needs to have every enterprise with workloads running in the Middle East alone, right, needs to start answering how they're going to deal with residency. Data residency exposure, specifically if the regions go offline for any amount of time, weeks, not hours, sort of thing. How does your business survive? What is the SLA and what does it actually cover in declared conflict zones? And what is the failover architecture? And when is the last time you tested it? Right? Most organizations cannot answer all three. The gap is now a business continuity risk, not a theoretical one, and this is gonna keep you from becoming valuable or keeping investors and money from growing within your circles. So, if you're a company who takes that seriously, the $300 billion question is who actually loses, right? And how the investments will be broken up in terms of the next thesis, because the current one is certainly malfunctioned or broken entirely, right? The entire Gulf AI zone and the build out was premised on three things itself: political alignment with Washington, abundant sovereign capital, and physical safety. Washington's decision to strike Iran is what put those investments in the line of fire. The security arrangements surrounding those deals were designed around geopolitics, specifically keeping advanced chips away from China. Nobody wargamed Iranian drones having strikes on the data centers and that those chips would be affected by this entire process. So what is most exposed right now is a couple of things that I brought up in a couple of the videos previously as well. So if you haven't taken a chance already to like and subscribe, please go ahead and do that. Share this video with anybody you think would find it interesting, and join my Substack and my TikTok so you can stay up to date on all of the content it might takes. But again, what is most exposed right now? The Stargate UAE project for OpenAI is the largest planned infrastructure outside the US. SoftBank's $40 billion bet is particularly predicated on Gulf expansion. I mentioned this in part two of the refinery paradox in general. Oracle is committed to a 1 gigawatt situation of computational capacity in Abu Dhabi. And that's part of that Stargate project that I've mentioned a couple of times. They're also cutting between 20 and 30,000 jobs domestically here in the US to fund part of the infrastructure globally. NVIDIA, they have GPU cells of the Gulf, where a significant part of their growth was that driver. The UAE alone approved to purchase up to 500,000 cutting edge NVIDIA processors annually, right? Every single year. Brookfield has confirmed that their $20 billion data partnership with Qatar Investment Authority is proceeding. Long term institutional capital funding is going to be holding firm, but repricing is really the area of interest here. Uh, this is where this story becomes really interesting for me. I am a big fan of Dr. Zhang. I don't know if you all have been watching Dr. Zhang, who is a professor from, I believe, Harvard. And Dr. Zhang has been just like giving master classes on what is exactly going on from the very beginning of the conflict. So if you're going to check them out on his YouTube channels, please check that out. I mean, he's amazing. He talks about something that is truly interesting in the conflict and how it happens over time, which is the data centers, but also the desalination plants that help with cleaning water, so that the area of the Gulf and all the people who live in the Gulf, they get fresh water. Because obviously living in a desert or living around a desert, they have to import a lot of their drinking water and their usable water. Um, some of those countries are more dependent than other countries. And so what we're seeing now is that data centers in these environments require, massive amounts of water for cooling. And so these have become automatic targets. Gulf states that get water from desalination plants are experiencing that targeted impact in the conflict. So, for instance, 90% of Kuwait's water comes from the process of having to clean it from desalination. 70% of Saudi Arabia's comes from the same process. 42% of the UAE's, all from this same process. So, major vulnerabilities, right? When you target the water supply, you're targeting the data center cooling system as well. And the infrastructure dependencies that stack up on these investments never accounted for this. They absolutely just never accounted for having to explore the world where the precious data centers are just not getting the type of water, cooling, energy resources. Because remember, these are huge projects that get investments up front for the construction and bonding for the construction. And then long term, the pricing is supposed to be relatively flat because of the way the deals are structured for data centers. I mean, they're huge investments, capital intensive up front. And then after that, really no reason, to keep the money going, right? I'm going to take a drink of my coffee. Give me a second. This is certainly not an advertisement. I am just in need of coffee these days. Okay. So what I think is really interesting by some of the stuff that we're talking about here, is that you have long-term institutional capital that is not running from the issue of the Middle East. They're repricing. They're going to reprice. I mean, that is how business is usually done during conflicts or issues. The $20 billion partnership in Qatar is proceeding. Signals that sovereign wealth funds back investments have a longer time horizon than corporate capex. But the repricing means that the cost of capital in the Gulf AI situation just went up, as I said. So how does that cost get passed down or passed around? Consumers, mostly, right? Which means you're going to be driving a lot of people away from these platforms. There are higher infrastructure costs, higher cloud costs, higher inference costs, and your enterprise is at the end of that chain. So how will you deal with it? In the next segment here, we're covering oil being at $113 a barrel in terms of that high price that it spiked to, and kind of what enterprises are going to be experiencing here in the upcoming days. So the energy to computational link that most people are certainly missing here is that every data center runs on power, clear. Power costs are indexed to energy markets. Energy markets just literally got repriced super hard. Brent crude hit 119 last week, settling around 113 in the last 24 hours. Triple digits are the floor now. Cloud computational costs flow energy prices typically from 60 to 90-day lag. So your Q2 infrastructure budget was modeled for $70 oil. That model's wrong. Nobody has told your CFO yet, or maybe your CFO knows, and you need to be expecting them to come around the corner any minute. But the situation with the Strait of Hormuz as an enterprise supply chain problem has demonstrated that because 20% of the global supply chain for oil goes there, it is now effectively closed, and that is effectively changing how physical products in your company get made, shipped, or distribute and run on that energy that moves through that strait. Logistically, costs are up. Manufacturing costs are up. Distribution costs are up. For every enterprise is running AI models, especially out of this region, the inference cost is about to be repriced at the same time your operational costs are being repriced. Two cost curves going up simultaneously, both downstream of the same choke point. So this is an incredible time, right? Incredible time for business leaders, decision makers, and kind of what is the next play, right? What do we see as the next play here? So interestingly enough, I have some data here about the global financial cascade, as I'm calling it. So you have the International Monetary Fund chief, or IMF, use the words prepare for the unthinkable. And you have G7 finance ministers calling for emergency meetings to discuss strategic oil releases. South Korea suspended stock trading via circuit breakers because they lost the most amount in 1 week since March 2020. In Japan's Nikkei down nearly 7% in the same time frame. This is not a regional conflict anymore, and you should be able to see that. This is a global economic effect. And so the financial cascade has already started, even just off of oil, and it's ending with the enterprise budget, which is not necessarily being seen today, right? Like the stuff we're talking about is not going to affect your conversations with your leaders and your decision makers until maybe another month or two. So again, Oracle cut between 20 and 30,000 jobs here locally in the United States. This is the great displacement, right? This is how it goes corporate. This is something I've been addressing on TikTok. So if you haven't already followed me on TikTok or on Substack, please take a moment, like, subscribe to this video, check out the other links for the other videos, check out the Refinery Paradox videos as well that I just dropped. We're almost at 100 YouTube subscribers. So I got to say thank you so much for that. I did not ever really think I would get to a place that even 100 people wanted to listen to me yet. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for just giving me a couple minutes. So when we talk about Oracle has been finalizing thousands of job cuts this month. Estimates have definitely shown that number. I already kind of revealed between 20 and 30,000 across all divisions. And as I've labeled on my TikTok videos, this is not a performance problem. Not a pure performance problem. Yes, there's speculation in many ways for Oracle, but this is not a revenue miss. This is a cash reallocation situation, right? $50 billion plus has been committed to AI infrastructure, including the Stargate UAE that it was, exposed to. So these are things that need to be considered, and humans are being, liquidated to fund the machines that I've kind of quoted there. And this is now in a shifting war zone, right? So the cruel irony that makes the refinery paradox that I've kind of talked about up to this point is that Oracle committed the Gulf AI infrastructure as part of the global refinery layer build out, and that infrastructure obviously is under attack by drone strikes, but the effects really are, other than loss of lives. Please, I'm not trying to be insensitive to that, but the downstream effects are that the infrastructure, the jobs being cut from that infrastructure, the people in Kansas City, Austin, and even some of them maybe in Abu Dhabi are these projects are currently on fire. So the business is trying to figure out how to respond to both letting folks go and the negative press for that. And now how do you respond to the business experiencing these issues in the Middle East or Southeast Asia, kind of whatever the label want to go there. That connection is not necessarily being made in the press, and for good reason, because it is downstream 2 or 3 months from now. So when you look at my paradox explaining my economic theorem at full speed, the extraction cost lands on the people furthest from the refining layer. And that will happen 99% of the time. So specifically, who needs to understand what is at risk? Corporate IT, right? Teams managing legacy Oracle database infrastructure, database administrators, Oracle's original core products, stuff like that. Enterprise software support, people who keep the old system running while leadership bets on the new one. These are not underperforming employees. These are people who built that revenue base and are now literally funding the transition for Oracle, and they're being removed from the situation, right? So this is a very real time situation of kind of like what is going on. So my prediction from my theorem really addresses this, that enterprise AI reduces into literally just two categories: profit and loss, right? Man hours recovered and expenses reduced. Oracle is not creating new value with its AI infrastructure bet. It is reallocating existing value from headcount to infrastructure, following the same quarterly optimization logic that has governed capitalism for well over 50 years. So the system does not change, it just tightens. And that is basically prediction for of my particular theorem. So go check that out, link in the bio or on my YouTube channel if you haven't already seen that. Segment 5 here for today is really how you as a practitioner or somebody who works in corporate America or global corporate, how are you needing to respond to what you're seeing right now? I would say question number 1 is, where is your AI infrastructure, data infrastructure, and how exposed is it to what is currently going on? You need to be able to map every cloud workload to its physical data center region. You need to be able to identify which regions have geopolitical exposure, not theoretical exposure, and current exposure. You need to know your failover architecture and test it before you need it. These are straightforward areas that will help you navigate the changes that are currently happening. Question 2 that I would say for practitioners is, what does our infrastructure budget look like with $113 per barrel oil? Does this mean you need to pull the infrastructure cost model? Does it mean you need to rerun it at 110, 120, $130 of oil? Are you able to account for that 60 to 90-day lag in cloud computing costs and repricing for the next quarter? And is leadership understanding that you need to have an analysis before the invoice arrives? So question 3 from here is, which of your AI vendors has Gulf exposure, and what is your transition plan? OpenAI, Oracle, NVIDIA all have material Gulf exposure. That exposure is now a vendor risk variable. Your procurement teams, your data engineering teams, architecture teams need to be able to track. So I would say this is not a moment to panic. This is a moment for you to assess, right? To know your exposure level before the vendor tells you about service degradations. And I would say this is a positioning move where this week, every data architect, cloud engineer, security architects, and enterprise leaders need to have broad level, board level conversations on a silver platter, right? Given what just happened to the AWS infrastructure in the Gulf, I want to walk leadership through our resilience exposure and our infrastructure and kind of talk about Q2, Q3, right? What are the conversations? That conversation positions you as a person who's thinking about this with the right altitude. Not the person who's asking for the pilot budget or the person who's out of touch, right? This gives you protecting and the organization protecting from a risk that your CFO or your risk teams have just not modeled in yet, right? So I have been able to work on the Refinery Paradox as I talked about. If you haven't already checked that out, that's a theorem that I have been building and I have published in the first 2 parts on my YouTube and my Substack. I've written in depth about them and provided plenty of examples. The theorem is all about data and AI infrastructure concentration. This week, we got to see that somebody bombed those refineries. That's technically the infrastructure for AI. So my metaphor has become real, like literal. And every enterprise that builds on this AI strategy is making assumptions that cloud infrastructure was invulnerable. And you just learned something valuable, pretty expensive as well. So three things to take away from what we've covered today, I would say, right, is physical infrastructure is now a military target. Your cloud has an address and you need to know where yours is. Two, your enterprise budget has never been modeled for the $113 that we're paying per barrel on the high end and where we are just on the high end in general. And when it comes to drone struck data centers and the closed Strait of Hormuz, how are you going to deal with this? Right. Three, the jobs that being cut to fund Gulf AI structure infrastructure are being cut this month, and the people paying the extraction costs are actually furthest from the refining layer. And that is a direct evidence call out from part one and part two of my theorem. So go check that out if you haven't already seen that. So again, if you have not checked out the Substack, the refinery report and the details on that, we'll definitely go deeper. Full infrastructure resilience framework and the vendor risk assessment questions are in there. The link is going to be in the description here or on my bio for the YouTube. If you haven't watched video one on the series, go watch that next and then go to part two. Everything we just covered is in there. But if you will, drop your industry below, drop a comment about what you've been dealing with and how you've been dealing with it. Tell me, how has your organization remodeled your infrastructure costs, assuming that you'll be dealing with this, post $100 per barrel oil situation. I want to know if you have an answer for that or if you guys are even dealing with it yet. But until next time, I'll see you tomorrow.